Seven, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History with Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way. So hello everyone, welcome back to the History of Jackson podcast. Today we welcome author and historian Dorothy Armstrong to discuss her book, and I've got it right here. It's a fantastic read with a gorgeous cover, actually. Heads of Empire, History of the World in 12 Carpets. How you doing, Dorothy?
Hi, very, very happy to be here. And by the way, the cover is not my responsibility. I can't claim credit for that. It's marvelous designers. Also, the beautiful map that's inside it is not me.
Well, they really, really add to the book. I mean, it's one of the most stunning covers I've seen for a long time. So
Thank you.
definitely does you justice.
Thank you.
So the first question I wanted to ask you, Dorothy, I know it's a bit cliche for historians and authors to be asked this question, but what inspired you to write this book?
I wanted to write a book that I wanted to read and that didn't exist. So I've been working for quite a long time as a researcher and a teacher in universities, teaching history of design, talking about material culture of Asia. And a lot of stories kept coming up about carpets, and those stories were very little told. I mean, there were one or two of them that were current, but mostly I was reading them for the first time, and I think of myself as, a reasonably savvy person about carpets. So I wanted to put those together and share them with people who I know many people are interested in carpets, and many people are kind of slightly put off by carpets because there seems to be a lot of arcane knowledge around them. But actually, the powerful thing about these carpets is not how many knots they have or how many warps and wefts they have, but the stories, the historical stories around them.
I really like that you wanted to write a book that you wanted to read. I think it's always very nice to hear historians say that.
Nobody was writing that book, so I had to do it myself in the end.
And it's such an interesting book. But I think before we dive into the conversation about the book and about the history, I think it's important for us to get some kind of context around it. You know, a lot of us take carpets for granted. So what is a carpet? Why are they so important?
So a carpet is any heavy textile that you might use for draping the floor, draping the walls, draping furniture. And one of the extraordinary things about carpets is that they are the first architecture. So there's a German art historian called Gottfried Semper from the 19th century, and he put forward this idea that before we had architecture, we had carpets. So basically, people would build a frame and they would drape it. And that's the origin of human architecture. And of course, once they started to do that, once they started to make heavy fabrics, the natural human instinct to design and beautify kicked in, and they started turning into these extraordinary objects that we see now. But it all starts with sheep. So one of the things that changed us from being hunter-gatherers into settled farmers in the Neolithic was the domestication of sheep. But we'd always had sheep from the beginning. So the old biblical stories have sheep wandering across biblical lands. And so you've got a world of huge flocks of sheep and nomads and shepherds, and they've got everything to hand that they need to make these heavy woolen textiles. So it's a combination of the earliest history of man's relationship to nature, sheep, and all the plants that make dyestuffs, and this early use of these heavy textiles before architecture as dwelling places.
And that's such an interesting history because when you look at your floor in your living room, you don't see thousands of years of development there.
Thousands.
So how are these carpets being made in these kind of tough to live places at times?
So the technology of carpet making is pretty much the same now as it always was. I mean, there was a big change during the 19th century where clever mechanized ways of making carpets came into being. But carpets throughout the world are still made on looms, either wooden frames that are upright or backstrap looms where you stick a stick in the ground and you put the warps and the wefts around your body, and that keeps them gives you tension. So because it's so lo-fi, it was easy to do. So they built a wooden frame, they strung threads around it. That's called warp. That's the basic structure of the carpet. And then they interwove threads between the warps, and that created a pattern and also gave the structure its stability. And we still do it that way today.
And I think it's really cool to see that that technology has largely stayed the same. But I think there's two questions there that kind of come to mind when you start talking about how carpets are made. And I think the first one is important to acknowledge who's making them, because I think that's an important question of, what position are they in society, and are they revered for their skill, or is it just seen as a skill that everyone should have?
So there was a long period of time before industrialization in the carpet weaving areas of the world where everybody at least was a spinner, right? Because it's sheep. It goes back to this sheep thing. So all the time people are spinning. You see photographs, you see drawings in more ancient times of people holding a spindle and just spinning as they talk, spinning as they drink tea. Everybody spins. Weaving can be a quite sophisticated technique. It was often largely the work of women, although the further east you go, the more men are involved in it. But let's just, for the sake of argument, say it's a women's craft. They learned it in childhood. The girls learned it at their mothers' and their aunts' knees. And often these looms are big, so you need 2 or 3 women weaving together, and the little girls would sit with the aunts and the grandmas and they would weave. Hugely respected skill in their own communities. They're often quite economically marginal, these people. They're often in villages or they're nomads. So I hesitate to say the word tribes, but they're moving around traditional routes with their own family groups, which can be huge, right? So within those communities, they're respected because they're producing the architecture for these people, that they have tents, they have carpets inside the tents, carpets on their beds. They're also where they trade, and they don't always trade. They are their goods that they can exchange for things that they can't make for themselves. So weaving is hugely important socially, ecologically, because you've got to use all this wool, and in terms of trade. That is not the only environment in which carpets are woven. That's the way that it starts, and then it spreads over time into urban workshops, in cities across the rug weaving belt in Eurasia, and into elite workshops. So the studios and ateliers of princes, shahs, sultans, the aristocrats of the rug weaving belt. And so you get very different types of carpets woven. And we tend to classify them rightly or wrongly. We say tribal and village carpets, workshop carpets, and court carpets. So those very elite carpets are called court carpets. And I've tried in the book to talk about a mixture of these different types of carpets to give a perspective on these different types of weavers. But Jackson, one of the heartbreaking things about writing about carpets is you can rarely hear their voices. So there they are making these, even when they're humble, they're full of heart. They're full of vivacity. They're full of imagination. And when they're very, very artistically refined, you still have very little chance of getting access to the weavers. So it's very interesting when people, anthropologists, for instance, go amongst weavers and talk to them and we hear their own voices. But that happens very rarely.
And when you're talking about the images that these carpets bring to mind and the people behind it, there's such artistry going into this work. And when you were describing the carpets, not a lot, not even when I've got to the picture pages, I could just see the color coming off the page and filling my mind with these carpets. So you talk about how they're bringing patterns in. Is there any significant or any meaning behind patterns in carpets?
Well, at the simplest level, you can say women were weaving motifs that they had learned in childhood. So there's a kind of feeling that certain motifs belong to certain communities. Okay, so at the very least, you are encountering a kind of artistic heritage of the community that wove that carpet. There are also, can I swear? Mildly, there's a lot of crap written about the motifs in carpets. There's a really urgent desire to decode them as if they were a code, a secret language. But actually, they've often come down to us through many generations, and the people who are weaving them couldn't really tell you a straight story about what they mean. So I was just talking about occasionally anthropologists go into tribes and talk to women about their weaving. And I talk about one of these in the book. And he was very keen to find out what specific motifs mean. And one of these old ladies said, "Well, we call it a henkel, but, it's got 19 other names. Who knows? I've been weaving it since I was a child." It's that kind of thing. But having said that, there are borrowings from great religious languages of decoration. Okay, so we see in that very oldest carpet that I talk about, the oldest carpet we have, not the oldest carpet that was woven, but the oldest carpet still in existence, which was found in Siberia and is about 2,000 plus years old. That has a lot of motifs in it that we can identify as being Buddhist, animist, so it has lotus blossoms in it. Lotus blossoms are found across Asia, and they have many, many meanings, but we know that they're part of religious iconography. But it's not a kind of one-to-one relationship, and it's not a relationship that's always clear to the weavers. And fashion plays a big part. So there's this great period of carpet weaving in the 16th century, in the 17th century in Persia and in India and in the Ottoman Empire. And things came into fashion and then went out of fashion. These carpets from Persia often have very large central medallions, we call them motifs. And you find them also on books, fantastic book covers. And this is just a fashion. You can kind of identify when it comes in because we've got quite a lot of objects that start bearing it. And you can identify when it goes out of fashion. So there's a combination of the kind of it's part of our community's culture and it's handed down. Things that do have some mysticism about them because they're borrowing from religious iconography and fashion. And in a way, it's no different to the way that things get designed now. When Palace, the guys who do the skateboards and so on, when they design a new skateboard, they're borrowing from their own heritage. They want to reference things that are very, very important in the kind of religion of skateboarding, and then they're putting a new twist on it as well. So it's kind of the same.
It's always nice to see those patterns repeating. I think you've almost put some art analysts out of a job with that answer there. But you mentioned something there about carpets surviving. I think I'd be in trouble with the listeners if I didn't ask. How do these carpets survive? Because traditionally I think we think that textiles don't survive quite as long. So how are they surviving thousands of years and that we're able to look at them and put them on display?
So you're absolutely right. They're much more vulnerable um, than ceramics or metal, although metalwork tends to get melted down. If you've got a fabulous gold object, it always has the risk of getting melted down. But, carpets wear, insects eat them, they're consumed by fire. They have a rough time, and also they're hard-working domestic objects. If you're a nomad and you've got a load of carpets that make up your tent and your bedding, you're constantly rolling them up and unrolling them. So where we have old carpets, we're very, very lucky. And then it's usually because of special circumstances. So the oldest carpet in the book survived because it was in the permafrost. It was in a barrow, a tomb of a Scythian chieftain from 500 BCE. And grave robbers went into the tomb. They broke through the permafrost and water rushed in and basically sealed all these organic objects, including bodies, in ice. So the thieves, the grave robbers, did a great term to archaeologists. So that carpet, which is the oldest we have, was just frozen and then was dug up by some Russian archaeologists in the 20th century. We have some fragments that are arguably marginally older. Everybody gets excited about the Pazyryk, the Siberian carpet, because it's almost complete, but there are some that are probably a bit older. And they were preserved because they were buried in middens. Middens are great, right? So the rubbish heaps that communities have, you throw away bits of rags and old stuff, and they get buried. And if you're lucky and the circumstances are right, they will be preserved. So they were thrown into the rubbish heaps in the middle of the Central Asian deserts, places like the Taklaman Desert, and it was just dry, and they were preserved. When you get into more recent times, so if you start to think about the 12th centuries, where we start to have 12th, 13th centuries, we start to have quite a lot of carpets compared to these very rare fragments. And quite a lot of that is because they were given as gifts to mosques. So there's a whole group of carpets called Seljuk carpets, and they're probably the next oldest after these fragments. And they were given to mosques, and they were just laid on top of each other in the mosque. So if the bottom carpets, they were just protected. They were protected from freak. They weren't necessarily the first target for moths. It's quite dry in the mosque. And so at the beginning of the 20th century, people started peeling back these carpets. And they were piles like 100 high, and at the bottom were carpets that came from the 12th and the 13th century Seljuk carpets. Later on, they became part of the cultural history of the social groups that made them. So the three big names in terms of making 16th and 17th century carpets, which is a great epoch of carpet making, classical carpet making, are the Ottomans, the Iranian Safavid emperors, and the Mughal emperors in India. And for anybody who can get to the V&A and go and see the Mughal exhibition that's on there at the moment, they've got 5 carpets, full-size carpets from the Mughal Empire in the V&A that they've borrowed from all over the world, so it's really worth going to see them. But at that stage, those carpets were being made for emperors, sultans, shahs. They were part of the performance of kingship. And so just like we preserve that kind of object now with a great deal of care, they were preserved in those sorts of environments.
No, I think it's really interesting the different areas that they are found, different ways of finding them. But when researchers and archaeologists find them, how do they go about creating or finding the provenance of these carpets? Because obviously, if it's layers and layers down in a mosque or it's found in a rubbish heap, it might be quite difficult to ascertain that. And then, what kind of images or narratives have we created about those groups after finding that? Because I think there's an interesting dynamic between that.
There is. The historiography of carpets is incredibly political. The stories that we've invented feed whatever our beliefs are at the time that we invent them. So there's 2 things. There's provenance and provenience. So provenance is about who owned it, right? So that's often quite relatively easy because we have inventories, we have textual documents. So we can say, well, Thomas Wolsey owned these 5 carpets and then they went to Henry VIII. So provenance isn't too bad. We can often track that. Provenience, which is where were they made, that's much more difficult. So, you get some stuff out of a midden in an oasis like Khotan in Central Asia, in the Uyghur Independent Province, and you've no idea where it came from. Okay, it's in that midden, but doesn't mean it was made in Khotan. It could have been made anywhere along the Silk Road because that was a massive river of ideas and objects that was going backwards and forwards. So knowing where things came from is incredibly difficult. And we often get ourselves very tied up about it. We do 2 things. One is and this has only happened really in the last 150 years, a lot of work has been done to research the technique that's used in a carpet. So there's not much that you're doing, right? You're stringing the warps, you are interweaving the wefts. If it's a pile carpet, with a velvety finish, then you're also looping extra threads and squashing them down with weft threads to keep them secure. And you're dyeing them, right? You're dyeing the wool. And you've got the wool, but again, there's a problem with locating the wool and the dyes because there's a huge trade across Eurasia in these things. But we can understand some things about technique. So some areas have become very closely associated with certain techniques, and really it's at the level of, well, maybe Egyptians spun their wool the other way round to the rest of the rug weaving belt. So we have this S and Z spun wool, counterclockwise or clockwise. So, okay, this has got a certain spin of wool, so maybe it comes from this area. Certain communities use multiple weft threads rather than just one, and they might put a color, like a red weft across it. But it's very, very fragile. As a technology to identify where things come from, it's fragile. And the other thing that we do, which is equally fragile in my view, is we try to put together groups of similar designs. Okay, so we say, this looks like another carpet that was made in Ushak in Anatolia in the 15th century. And so we think this is an Ushak carpet. We even go to the level of villages. This looks like a carpet that comes from Selendi. We've got another carpet that comes from Selendi just outside Ushak. So maybe this one does too. And on this, a huge edifice has grown. If, like me, you're a bit contrarian, you can very easily unpick this. Although we have to respect the body of knowledge that's been put together that is repeatedly tested against other carpets that come onto the market. And there are a lot of contributors to this. So the auction houses have very knowledgeable people who've seen a lot of carpets. And so they say, this looks a bit like that. Its technical structure's a bit like that. It's probably this, but we can't really go much further than that. So the real answer to your question about where they are made is it's very hard to know.
No, I could certainly see that in the book, and when you were answering that question there, because there's so many different factors in terms of styles and the way it's made. That also raises a very interesting question about the different types of carpets. Were the different types of carpets from different areas seen differently in the period where people were beginning to trade and collect carpets?
Well, the first big success story was Anatolian carpets. Anatolian carpets got there first. The Ottomans were great traders. Also, they had a huge amount of territory. They pushed as far as Vienna into Europe, and they were trading all the time, not only to the west, to Europe, but also across Asia to the east, to Central Asia, Japan, China. So we can underestimate the power of the Silk Roads. Stuff was going backwards and forwards. So the earliest real kind of international global carpet successful commodity were Anatolian carpets of, say, the 15th and 16th centuries. One of the curiosities of carpet histories is that they were bought by artists and then they were used in paintings by artists. And so that gives us a reasonable fix on how old they are. So if you've got Charlemagne kneeling on a carpet, an Anatolian carpet, painted by the master of Saint Denis in the 15th century, then you know those carpets were about amongst elite classes in the 15th century. And that domination of Anatolian carpets really carried through to the 19th century. They were the carpets of choice, particularly in Europe. Then in the 19th century, and Iran is further away. Okay, so Iran doesn't come into the story until quite late on. The other carpets that were traded enthusiastically into Europe in this early period, what we call the early modern period, are Mughal carpets, because of course there were big trading relationships with India. The Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company, they were trading directly with India. And one of the things that was coming back were these amazing Mughal carpets now on display in the V&A. So you've got Anatolian carpets and you've got Mughal carpets. Mughal carpets, My sense is were more expensive, and the Anatolian carpets were more popular. So you get really large numbers of Anatolian carpets at prices that a leather merchant in Transylvania could buy, 6. Whereas a great Mughal carpet might be commissioned by one of the City of London um, trading bodies and sit on their wall in their hall. That's a slightly different thing. But Iranian carpets, they were slightly more mysterious. But stories came out of Iran from ambassadors, from traders, that there were fabulous carpets in Iran. But it wasn't really until the 19th century they became a popularly traded commodity. And then suddenly in the 19th century, Persian carpets become enormously popular. And Ottoman carpets, they've been around a while. And Indian carpets got a bit of a reputation in the 19th century for being compromised by the fact that the British had turned them into a trading commodity and influenced traditional styles. So the story is Anatolia is there first. And Anatolia is there through to the 19th century. The Mughals are a rather special thing, but there's a lot of Mughal interaction because of the trading companies. And then suddenly people start to become aware of Persia quite late on in the 19th century. There was a bigger exhibition in Paris in, I think, 1878. I mean, as late as that. And the guy who later became the director of the V&A said, this is a branch of Asian art that curators of great museums don't know anything about. And that was Persian carpets in private collections that were suddenly on display.
I think that really shows how carpets are intrinsically tied in with the growth of global trade and globalization. But you've mentioned, those private collections, which I think are incredibly interesting. So when does this private trading, private collecting of carpets really kick off, and what does it tell us about the efforts to save some of these carpets?
So private collections of the very wealthy can be found strongly in the Renaissance records. So we know that the Italian princes collected them. We know that Henry VIII, Elizabeth collected them. We know that great merchants collected them in the Renaissance, and we know that churches collected them. We know they were definitely there in the Renaissance. They were probably there before, but we've lost both the records and the carpets. But we can be absolutely confident that they were catnip to rich people by the Renaissance. And what does it tell us about both why they were collecting them and how they preserved them? Well, they cost a fortune, genuinely cost a fortune. And they had to be imported. So there was a huge additional extra cost, especially if they were coming from Persia and India. The Anatolian trade is different because that was a kind of almost like a modern trade. They had the whole thing worked out and they could move things around quite easily. So they were very, very expensive. So they were cared for. But more than that, they had become part of the apparatus of power. So if you're Henry VIII at the moment when you've just told the Pope, and it's a bit like Trump and Putin at the moment, it was an electrifying moment. You've just told the Pope that you are going to marry whoever you like, and in order to do that, you are going to take over the Church of England. Right? Incredible moment of overreaching and geopolitical tension. What is going to happen? Is the whole of Europe going to explode into warfare because of this? You have yourself painted by Holbein standing on one of these precious Asian carpets. And you're saying a lot of things by doing that. You're saying, I am the kind of person with the kind of means and power to acquire this kind of thing. I am a great global ruler. So great a global ruler am I that I stand on your artifacts. They are under my feet. So he's sending a big signal about what kind of a person the Pope might have to deal with. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, well, Habsburg Empire as it was then, is going to have to deal with. I stand on the carpet of sultans, right? So watch out. So there's a lot of this performative stuff goes on. And once you've done that and you've associated a particular carpet with your image, you take care of it. And they didn't put them on the floor, of course, unless they wanted to demonstrate that they could stand on them. They were powerful enough to stand on them. They put them on tables, particularly on tables. They hung them on walls. So that helped to protect them. But carpets that are in private collections, they've often survived very well because they've not been in the hurly-burly of ordinary carpet life. They haven't been walked on. Cinders from fires haven't fallen on them. They tend to be well looked after.
And I think that point about Henry VIII is particularly poignant, as you said, because it does show that power, and it does show the power of imagery within there to the rest of Europe.
This is all propaganda. And because these things could be rolled up and carried anywhere you wanted, because they could be used to dress like a theatre, a site of power, be it a mosque, or if you're having a big conference to end the Second World War, like Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin at Yalta, you can just roll these carpets up and you can take them there, and suddenly you've got a grand environment. And there's something very powerful about the fact that they're not your carpets. You've got them somehow, either through spoil, warfare, purchase. The very fact that you have these exotic objects from a different culture says something about the reach of your power.
I really like how you've raised the Yalta Conference as well within that, because you also mentioned in the book that carpets are kind of taken, an art in the 20th century after the wars is taken as this kind of spoil of conflict. How does, and you mentioned at the beginning of your book, you didn't quite think that Stalin was going to be such a central figure through several of your chapters. So how do the Russians keep turning up in this story of carpets?
Well, it's partly the choice that I made, of course. I had to choose 12 carpets and I had 12 fascinating stories in my mind. But one of the reasons the Russians are so much there is that in modern times, they've controlled Central Asia, So until 1989, stans were all Soviet satellites. And Central Asia is one of the great carpet producing areas of the world. It is the great carpet producing area in terms of volume in Eurasia. So they're there partly because they were in those territories. They also, in the 19th century, so taking a step further back, there was a big attempt to expand the Russian Empire, and they expanded southwards. So not only into Central Asia, but also to Iran. They tried to get as far as India, but of course, there they met the British. So that was kind of the final limit that they went to. But that meant that their hunger for territory, for power, was always bringing them right up against these great carpet making areas. So it's to do with partly with Russian imperial history, both under the Tsars and under the Soviets. That was the territory that they took. But of course, there's a special sort of twist on this Russians in the book, because I have two exceptional stories. One is of this very old carpet that was found in Siberia, and the terrific struggle that there's been throughout 20th century Soviet history into 21st Soviet history about who that carpet belongs to and what it means in terms of the Slav deep past. Who owns this carpet? And the other story is the fact that there were carpets underfoot when this absolutely seminal picture was taken of Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill at Yalta. So they've just divided up the world, right? China, Japan, Central Asia, Europe. And they're sitting at Yalta, which is in the Crimea. Stalin had insisted that they hold it at Yalta, partly to diminish Roosevelt's physical stamina because he was very sick. So Stalin had all the cards anyway. Rather, as Trump tells us, Putin has all the cards today. He had all the cards because they needed him to fight in Manchuria. And So they had to please him. But he'd also insisted that they go onto his territory, and then his people dressed that photograph. And under his feet is this white ground carpet that could come from Azerbaijan or could come from the northern parts of Iran where Russia had most influence. But it's definitely a kind of Russian territorial. But the bit about that story that I like most is now that I've seen the Netflix series A Gentleman in Moscow with Ewan McGregor, that hotel is probably where that carpet came from. Okay. So the Soviets kept quite a few of the grand hotels in Moscow as centers for their operations, but also as hotels. And when they tried to dress up the palaces in Yalta for the great diplomatic conference, they brought the fittings down from Moscow because they didn't have anything in Crimea. It had been completely destroyed by the Nazis. So it's possible, in my mind, and I deeply hope, that it comes from that hotel, the Metropole, which you can now look at on Netflix.
I think that's a really, really nice story, actually. And I love that picture of the big three there, or the big troika, as you refer to them.
The big troika and the bigger Stalin. So when they made a sculpture of that picture, they made Stalin marginally bigger than both Churchill and Roosevelt.
And only for Stalin. Only for Stalin. Well, I think that's a nice point now to ask you a final fun question, Dorothy, as we do for everyone who comes onto the podcast. Now, I know this is a bit of a harsh question, but do you have a favourite carpet?
Favorite from my book or a favorite in life?
Or you can choose either one of them, whichever one you prefer, or both.
My favorite carpet from the book is a carpet that was made in the Caucasus, probably around the 17th century. So it's not one of these great court carpets. It's probably a workshop carpet made by a very, very accomplished village or urban weaver, but not one of these great Sultan Shah samurai carpets. And it's called a dragon carpet because it's got motifs that we kind of read as dragons, but we don't know what they are. It was in the Mint in Berlin where all the objects that couldn't be taken to the mines were put for safekeeping during the Blitz of Germany by the RAF. And there was one night late on in the war where the RAF carpet bombed Berlin and the Mint burned, and all the carpets in the Mint were to some degree or another damaged. And this carpet had been rolled and it only smouldered, so that when they unrolled it, it's like a fabulous snakeskin. So it starts off as a dragon carpet. It makes its way to Berlin, where there's a great collection of carpets, put into the Mint for safekeeping, and then it burns, but it doesn't get destroyed. It comes out as a fabulous snakeskin of a carpet. So that's my favorite carpet in the book. My favorite carpet in life is one that my son bought for me when he was in Azerbaijan, in Baku, and he was doing his kind of, gap year traveling around the Caucasus and Central Asia. And he sent me this desperate message saying, "Send me money by Western Union now. I need to buy some carpets." And he was sitting with the dealer in Baku drinking tea, and he got a bit involved and said he would buy these carpets. And so he needed some money. So I sent him some money. At that time in my life, I had a Western Union account because I was always sending money out to weird places. So now it's in my office. And in fact, I wrote a lot of this book with my feet resting on that carpet.
I think they're both really nice answers. I think they're both lovely answers. Thank you very much for sharing them. Now, obviously, people are going to want to learn so much more about the stories that we've already touched upon today. So where can people get a copy of Threads of Empire?
Well, you can get it from the publisher, Weidenfeld and Nicholson, or you can get it on Amazon. It's on Amazon for pre-order now. And if you want to hear me talk more about this, I'm giving a talk at the V&A on the 1st of May, 21st of March, and I'm giving a a talk at the Oxford Literary Festival on the 1st of April, and I'll be telling more stories from the book at those events.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And I'll make sure a link for the book is in the description below, and a link for a couple of the talks there are there as well. But then how can they keep up to date with you as well?
Well, I'm rather boringly only on these academic websites. You can look at me on the Ashmolean website because I'm a fellow at the Ashmolean, and they have a little biography and list of stuff I've written. And I'm also on the boring academic website. So one of them is called academia.edu and the other is called ResearchGate. And there I've uploaded all kinds of articles and book chapters that I've written in the past.
Awesome. I love academia.edu and ResearchGate, so they're not boring at all. But thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's been a delight.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The History with Jackson podcast. Hello and welcome to the History of Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way.